Today we're looking at the way of Luke chapter 14. Every chapter we take a look at and see what is that common thread, what is the way revealed of that chapter. The Lord said about himself that he is the way, the truth, and the life. When the way becomes a person, or when the way is a person, which is the person of Christ, it answers so many of our spiritual questions. It answers the question of who. It answers the question of where. It answers the question of how. And the answer to all three of those is the Lord Christ himself. Everything he teaches and everything that he says points us to the character of God and who he is himself. And so when we look at the chapter, Luke chapter 14, we see that there is this common thread of poverty. Now, it begins with the story of the man who had dropsy and was healed, showing the poverty of everyday life, of illness, of suffering. Then the Lord himself speaks to the people at the feast that he was at and tells them to seek the poverty of position. He says, don't be ambitious to sit in the best places. Don't seek the best places, but rather go to the lowest place. And he reveals the way of that poverty as something that he himself lived and did. He always sought to go to the lowest place. He had the option of being born of anyone and living anywhere and doing anything he wants. He is God. But he chose to be born of the poorest young girl, Saint Mary, poor in spirit and poor materially. He chose to be born in a manger in extreme poverty. He lived in Nazareth and labored as a carpenter in poverty. He always sought the lowest place. Now, just think of this in your day. Do we seek the lowest place? Do we want to go to the lowest place? Do we want that type of poverty? Then he talks about the poverty of giving without expecting in return. So unconditional giving. Giving without a hope of a reward. This type of poverty also is something that's very practical, and it shows us who the Lord himself is. He is the one that gives without expecting in return. He's the one that in the story of the woman who came to his feet and washed his feet in Luke chapter 7 speaks of a parable of two people. One owed 50, one owed 500, and both had nothing with which to repay, and he freely forgave them both. So he tells us to freely forgive, to freely give without hope of return. When you have a party, invite those who cannot invite you back, who cannot repay you. Then he speaks about the poverty of that great banquet. He talks of a man, which in this story is God himself, inviting people to a banquet. And those who had possessions, those who felt like their lives or knew their lives to be about possessions. So their lands, the one who had land, the one who had bought a cow, the one who was married and had a family, those three in their sense of ownership or possession were asked for an excuse to not go to the great banquet. So they were unwilling to go to the banquet. And so the master says, go find the poor, go find the blind, the lame, the maimed, those who cannot pay me back, and bring them to the banquet. And so here we see that it is those who are poor are the ones that are received into the kingdom, because this is a parable of the kingdom. They're the ones that don't have anything holding them back from receiving the kingdom. In fact, it's just about, being aware and not having anything in the way, nothing stopping you from accepting the invitation of God to be in his kingdom. After that, he speaks very openly about the poverty of not worshiping anyone or being attached to anyone, father, mother, brother, sister, wife, and children, and our own life. We must hate our own life. He speaks about the poverty of taking up the cross. No, this is the very thing that he himself lived as well. Again, the way of chapter 14 reveals to us the character of God and the way in which we ought to walk. He kind of climaxes this whole chapter on poverty by saying, count the cost, and unless you forsake everything that you have, you cannot be my disciple. And so the Lord is inviting us to walk in the way of his poverty. There's so many people, disciples, who walked in this way of poverty, and they all had something in common. They all lived an incredibly beautiful, spiritually rich life. People like St. Francis of Assisi, there's this beautiful scene when he is touched and believes in the gospel. He has this encounter with a leper. Now it used to be that Francesco Bernardone, who before he was St. Francis, was like terrified of lepers. In fact, he used to hold a cloth to his nose and only pass by their houses like 2 miles away. But one day he has this encounter with a leper, and he feels or believes that he saw the face of Christ. And he was going out to battle. He stops and he comes back to this leper that he sees, and he takes him onto his horse and asks him to lead him to the leper village. And it says that this encounter with poverty, this encounter with the lepers, very shortly after led him to go to his house and to literally throw out his possessions from the window and the possessions of his father, telling his father to be free like him. And St. Francis and his friars lived in extreme poverty the rest of their lives, and loving all those and serving all those around them. When I think of poverty, I think of Saint. His name is Amba Abraham. He's a bishop from the 19th century, and he lived in incredible poverty. And in his poverty, was so generous to the poor. He gave freely to anyone who came to him. I had the opportunity to go and see where he was, and they kept his clothes kind of in a shrine in Upper Egypt, in Fayoum. And I remember seeing his robe and just being moved by, this is the robe of a bishop, and I don't think anyone would accept to wear his clothes because of how poor they were and how simple they were. And he lived a rich life of love. In fact, he became a miracle worker, and so many people were blessed by him. I think of people who walked the way of poverty, of Mother Teresa, who lived among the poor and said, you must be poor in order to serve the poor. She didn't allow her sisters to have more than 2 tunics, just like St. Francis. They were only allowed 2 saris, one to wear and one to wash, and all of their possessions could be kept in a little plastic shopping bag. And it was not just the physical poverty that they lived, but the poverty of simplicity, and the poverty of joy, the poverty of humility. And yet when we think of Mother Teresa or Amba Braham or St. Francis, we think of them as heroes and saints. We think of them as people who lived the way of poverty and experienced the riches of having God as their wealth, as their treasure. And yet, we think of these people, we see Christ, and we see the clear invitation for poverty. And yet it stands in such stark contrast to our way of life. We are encouraged to refine our tastes, to refine our comforts. I remember going to buy a bed and spending all these hours in the mattress store, going from bed to bed and describing, this is memory foam, and this has this type of firmness level, and this type. I think, man, when did we, when and how did we, become so sophisticated in our desires and our longing for pleasure and for comfort. And this way of poverty, the way of Christ that he's inviting us to, is completely contrary to our materialistic and consuming culture. May today we take a step towards this poverty for our sake, not for anyone else's sake, for our sake, that we may become aware of the banquet, that we may be willing to enter into the banquet, that we may experience God as our treasure and the Lord Christ himself as enough. Have a beautiful day.